like to acknowledge I'm standing on Noongar land, as we all are, and acknowledge the Noongar owners, past, present and future. I guess I'm a worker, and I came to be involved in politics because of my values and who I am and where I work. I've lived in the Fremantle area for about 20 years, both Hamilton Hill and Hilton, mostly in Hilton. I'm a mother, I'm not married, boo hiss. I married into a Noongar family, but that's Noongar way, not Wodjila way, so that's very different, so it might not adhere to those Christian values, I'm not sure. I come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background. My family are migrants, and in other words, non-English speaking background. I work in community mental health. I've started a program with my colleague to address the gap in community mental health services, and so we exist working from plot funding to deliver a service that doesn't exist because our mental health services aren't funded adequately. So that puts my life in a fairly precarious position as an employee. I work in the Fremantle area, and the program is about community development, social inclusion, and having the most marginalised people engaged in our community. So I've got a fairly vast experience in terms of being on the other side of the tracks, I guess. And I've also been part of my union. I'm a unionist, and I've been on the Pay Equity campaign, which involves human services. And it's partly a gender issue, but it's also partly how our society and our government views business as being more important than people. That's why we don't adequately fund human services, and that's the area I work in and why I fight in the union as well, and why I do what I do in my work. Yeah, so the fundamental thing there is a lack of funding, ongoing and supported. I'm a candidate with the Socialist Alliance. For me, it's a party that is truly democratic because it works towards being a participatory democracy as opposed to representative. And I guess we probably all know what that is. You know, we elect a government and they then go away and talk about issues and then decide for us. Whereas participatory democracy is about bringing politics to people. People discuss the issues and vote on and decide the directions it goes. So essentially that's where socialist politics is and why I come to socialist politics from my background.
As the federal member for Fremantle, assuming that you're elected, how will you help the electorate secure the resources to create and maintain a new generation of community infrastructure for the city in the form of performing arts venues and low-cost spaces for artists in both the performing and graphic arts area? Australia used to have a lot of public money going to the arts. That was before Labor introduced economic rationalism and company tax was reduced from 60% to 30%. So the answer to all our infrastructure shortages in Australia lies in raising the company tax rate and using the resources, super profits tax, things like that actually need to go into the well-being, and things like arts programs adds to the well-being of community. So for example, the resources super profits tax shouldn't be to lower company tax, it should be going into those programs. My own daughter was involved in community arts within the community, and they used to exist from plot of funding to plot of funding, again existing like me, not having secure jobs themselves, to keep that program rolling through. And it was really to give art to disadvantaged kids, so kids that wouldn't be able to access dance programs, circus skills programs, things like that. My daughter, as a result, has continued in the arts, and she's in a dance college now and a performing arts college. She wouldn't have had those opportunities. I was a single mum, I didn't have the money for that kind of stuff. And if it wasn't for those fantastic people who did that community arts sort of stuff, kids like that wouldn't ever get the opportunity to do those things, and we need to continue to support those through those tax deductions. Thank you very much. Well done. Given that WA is facing a skills shortage, and knowing the importance to the economy and to the region of education programs for foreign students, can you please explain the rationale for your party's immigration policy and the likely impact on Australia's future, and in brackets, and not just the policy for asylum seekers?
Yes, immigration policy is far broader than asylum seekers. We need to end 457 skilled visa policies under the conditions they're under now. If we have skilled migration, these people deserve to have full citizenship rights. We can't barter with people's rights. It's not fair for us to take people from other countries and use their skills and then throw them away when we decide that they no longer meet our needs. They need to have rights to be here, and we need to support that. We need to supplement those sorts of things though with compulsory apprenticeship ratios. So that means putting training apprentices in workplaces in proportion to how many skilled people are there. So that's putting Australian kids into apprenticeship programs at the same time. Asylum seekers are a part of this equation. Currently, to process asylum seekers offshore costs $244 per day. If they're processed here in the community, it's $33 per day. The money that's saved on that can actually be put into training in skills.
How would you personally go about enhancing our education system, early childhood through to tertiary, in Australia for the benefit of current and future generations?
As a socialist, education needs to be public, it needs to be free, and it needs to be accessible to everybody. That's the leveller there. Whilst we do support autonomy for schools, it needs to remain centralised to some aspect so that the governments can't use it as a way for schools to take the brunt of cost cutting. If we look at the Finnish model of education, it is a single-tier public education system, and they have the highest literacy and numeracy levels in the world. Now, they also work on a collaborative model as opposed to a competitive model. They did that in the 70s, and it was an experiment that worked. Also, countries like Venezuela, which had massive illiteracy and massive poverty, can eradicate illiteracy by nationalising their oil company and using those profits to fund education, to fund literacy. Then we can do it because we're an affluent country. We shouldn't have education problems. We've got the resources. We can support education.
Oxfam is concerned about climate change because we believe that poor people in developing countries are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We believe that two major responses of the Australian government should be: one, commit to a strong pollution reduction target of 40% by 2020, and two, contribute our fair share to UN fund to help developing countries adapt to the impacts of climate change and to reduce their emissions. So, would you please tell us why you and your party will or will not make these same two commitments to the Australian people?
100% renewable energy grid by 2020. The climate science says we've got 10 years to do it. We need to start and act now. Beyond Zero emissions have already done a blueprint, costed, and basically it costs per year 37 billion, I think, and it's basically the same amount that it costs for the subsidies to fossil fuel industries, apparently. It has to be publicly owned so we can have accountability and to ensure that it is done and provided to the people now and in the future. It means tens of thousands of green jobs, and people in the coal industries can be transitioned into those new jobs. So there's heaps of work to be done in there as well. As to the whole climate denial thing, I think Russia had 40 degrees over the weekend and also bushfires. I mean, hello, this is Russia. I think we can say that the global warming is having an impact. We definitely have to lead in the technology because we're in that position, and that must be transferred and subsidised to developing nations because we have primarily polluted the world as the developed nations.
Hello, I'd like to address this question to all members of the panel. This campaign is one of the first that I can remember where we've heard very little about Indigenous issues. So I'd like to first of all ask you what you'd be doing to recognise the Indigenous people in our Constitution, and secondly, what will you be doing to help close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people?
Both major parties haven't done anything in this regard. They've both supported the anti-intervention, which has made conditions worse for Aboriginal people in this country. That needs to be dismantled immediately. And we also have to look at other countries with Indigenous populations where they have treaties and land rights and stuff like that. The outcomes are better. They're still not good, but they're better than here because rights are, at least in some part, recognised. Again, we've got to look at why wasn't Aboriginal issues addressed here in this election, because they're used as a political football as they are with asylum seekers. The last election it was used under anti-intervention. Why isn't it brought up that now? Because they'd actually have to examine anti-intervention and its failures, and both parties have supported that.
The Liberal parties lifted the ban on uranium mining in WA, and Federal Labor lifted its 3 mines policy, and Environment Minister Peter Garrett approved the expansion of the Beverley uranium mine, and is set to approve WA uranium mines. What is your position on WA's role in the nuclear industry?
100% renewables by 2020 doesn't include nuclear or uranium mining. The other thing is we've got to recognise is that they're approving radioactive waste dumps in the NT. You know, the NT intervention was used as a bit of a ruse to enable us, enable the government to mine uranium and also then use it as a dump at the Mukati community. So, I mean, we all need to come together as a community to make sure this doesn't happen, because it will, I think, under the government. And, you know, the current governments, the major parties, I think, will end up supporting it. So we all need to come as a community and keep on this, because we can't let it happen.
What are your positions on light rail for Fremantle?
The Socialist Alliance supports the light rail plan that the Greens launched last week, and it needs to be the model to be put across all cities in Australia. We need to get cars off the road. We also need to get freight onto rail as well, so we have to get trucks off the road as well.
You mentioned affordable housing, and certainly in this electorate and for young Australians, how do you plan to achieve this proposal?
Public housing needs to be massively expanded. It needs to be the third alternative option and a viable option for all people. It shouldn't be a social welfare safety net measure. It should be put in place to drive down house prices so that people on low incomes can even look at buying their own houses. We need to invest in public housing. In the 50s, apparently the average house price was 3 times the annual wage. And today it's about 7 times the annual wage. So it's actually becoming out of the reach of everybody because of the increase in house prices. So we need to massively increase public housing to drive down house prices as well.
Okay, Dave, do you want to comment?
I don't think anyone's mentioned work choices tonight. The Labor government claims they've ripped up work choices, but on an honest analysis would have to admit that substantial parts of work choices still exist. It still is not, workers don't have the democratic right to withdraw their labour. There still are, there still is the Australian Building Construction Commission. Significant aspects of work choices still exist. Kate Davis and Sanna Andrew are both in the Australian Services Union. I would like you to comment on the industrial relations and what should happen from in the next Parliament. When you speak to unionists, they call it work choices light now and fair weather. Rather than Fair Work Australia. It's gone a little bit of the way, but not far enough. We need to institute rights back in for workers, and yes, we need to go much further than how it goes now at the moment. And the ABCC, it has the powers of secret police, basically, and Archetribe is currently going for the courts, and he may end up facing imprisonment for not answering to them. And he has a right to keep his union meeting private with his union members, but under the ABCC and their powers, they are able to imprison him if he gives that information, which is taking away workers' rights. All policies should be directed at the well-being of all people. It should be directed to those who can't afford to access services and housing, etc. That should be done with taxes to big business and the mining industries. If they complain, nationalise, because the workers are there to carry out the work, and then we have all the money to pay for everything we need. It can be done, it's been done in other countries.